Great to see everyone. I'm John Levin. Welcome. Welcome to the launch of the new Stanford Capitalism and Democracy initiative. And I want to extend a special thank you and congratulations to Anat and Lisa for, first of all, launching this initiative, and secondly, for putting together this event. So I want to say a little bit about the genesis of this collaboration, which is a collaboration between the Stanford Business School and the Freeman-Spogli Institute, and about the intellectual foundation for this initiative, which really resides in the work of Anat Admati, professor at the GSB. This program is a collaboration between the Center for Democracy, Development, and the Rule of Law, which is one of the flagship centers within the Freeman-Spogli Institute, and the Corporations and Society Initiative, which is one of the flagship initiatives within the GSB. I'm going to speak to the Corporation Society Initiative for a minute, and then I'm going to introduce Catherine Stoner, who's going to talk about CDDRL and the work that is done there. The Corporation Society Initiative has been run for quite a number of years at the GSB by Anat Admati, and now with the support of Lisa Simpson, the executive director. And in Anat's words, it was set up to deal with inconvenient issues that we often choose to avoid or ignore. And for those of you who know Anat, you will know that she is comfortable raising difficult issues, and in fact prides herself on raising those issues with pretty much everyone, with CEOs, with bank regulators, with tech executives, with policymakers, with her colleagues at the business school, with me. She has does not shy away from difficult questions or pushing people to try to understand hard issues around business, around governance, around the rule of law, and around democracy. And this initiative, which is a new chapter and opens up a new collaboration, is going to be centered exactly at that intersection of business decision-making, policy-making, and the foundations of democratic institutions, which is a topic near and dear to Anat's heart and centrally important for both the Business School and the Center for Democracy, Development, and the Rule of Law. And I will just say that apart from being excited specifically about this initiative, I'm really excited to have a new collaboration between the GSB and the Freeman-Spogli Institute, and between CDDRL. We have one person who spends time, one faculty member who spends time as a senior fellow also in CDDRL. And as some of you will know, we do have a wonderful marriage between the GSB and CDDRL. But having the main locus of collaboration be within the Paul Oyer, Catherine Stoner household, this is really taking it out into the open and creating more of a forum for other people to be involved in the debate and discussion. So with that, I'm going to thank Anat, thank Lisa, and introduce Catherine Stoner, who is the head of the Center for Democracy Development and the Rule of Law.
Thank you, John. So yes, I'll do anything for Stanford. I'll even marry someone from the GSB, cross campus, and see what it's like over here, how the other half lives. So as John said, I am the Mosbacher Director of the Center on Democracy, Development, and the Rule of Law, and it's my pleasure to welcome you this afternoon and to enjoy this beautiful room. We will let you see the view later when we have our reception at the end of today's event. But it's also a thrill to introduce this new program on capitalism and democracy that, as John mentioned, is really the brainchild of Anat Admati. We are very much looking forward to integrating her further and this program further into the Center on Democracy, Development, and the Rule of Law. So for those of you who are at the business school, I'll just tell you that if you cross the street that way, there is a whole university. And part of that university over there is the Freeman-Spogli Institute, which is in Encina Hall, just sort of exactly where I'm pointing, I think. And we are, as John mentioned, a center within the Freeman-Spogli Institute. It has, I think, now 7 constituent centers. And we think we're the biggest, and we know we're the best, right, Larry? We work on basically as an interdisciplinary team. We were actually originally founded as a joint project between the business school, the law school, and humanities and sciences. And one of the faculty that spearheaded the founding was our deceased but dear colleague, John McMillan. So it's great to reestablish closer ties with the business school as well, despite my own personal ties, which are very close with the business school. Hi, honey. Okay, so we'll move on. John raised it, might as well just keep going with it. It's my job to tell you both a little bit about the program on capitalism and democracy, and also to introduce our speakers, which is the main draw today. So the program on capitalism and democracy will explore, as John mentioned, the complex interactions between democratic institutions, markets, and private sector participants. Sometimes corporations are causes for good, and sometimes corporations may undermine the resilience and quality of democracy. And these are the sorts of questions that we hope the program on capitalism and democracy will get to. It is, I think, particularly appropriate today that we have Patrick Ali with us, one of the co-founders of Global Witness, they study corruption in particular, to launch this program with Anat Admati. And they will talk about, is democratic capitalism in crisis? I'm guessing I know the answer, but let's see. They will be in conversation with my dear friend and colleague, Larry Diamond. But first, let me say some spectacular things about these spectacular people. First, and maybe you can come sit down as I introduce you guys, since you're hovering on the side there, is Anat Admati herself, the G.C. Parker Professor of Finance and Economics at Stanford at the Graduate School of Business. She's also has a range of affiliations around the university. I will just hit the highlights, though. She is a senior fellow at CEPR, our sister institute for economic and policy research. Faculty director, as was mentioned, of CASI, that is Corporations and Society Initiative with which we are partnering today. Anat does work at the interaction of business law and policy, focusing on governance and accountability issues, in particular with corporations and banks and the financial sector. She has been, since 2010, the financial crises, been engaged in policy discussions related to financial regulation. She was named in 2014 as one of Time Magazine's 100 most influential people in the world, and by Foreign Policy Magazine as among 100 top global thinkers. She is the co-author with Martin Hellwig of The Banker's New Clothes, What's Wrong with Banking and What to Do About It, with Princeton University Press, an expanded edition published in 2024. And perhaps among her many accolades, I would be remiss if I did not mention that she is probably the only Stanford faculty member to have ever had a cameo role on the sitcom Silicon Valley. Seated next to Anat is Patrick Ali, who is the co-founder, as I mentioned, of Global Witness, an organization that identifies key links between environmental and human rights abuses and is one of the pioneers of the global anti-corruption movement. Since 1995, Global Witness has garnered significant accolades and a lot of global recognition, including nominations for the 2003 Nobel Peace Prize and other prestigious awards. It is behind the Publish What You Pay initiative that pressured oil and mining companies to report the fees they pay to various governments so that they can be held accountable for the money that they receive. And I believe they're selling the book, Very Bad People, which is a book by Patrick Ali. And having read just the first page, the testimonials, Global Witness is part of a global Machiavellian plot, MPLA government, Angola. They're corrupt, in case you didn't get it. Yeah. Global Witness are worse than the Khmer Rouge, Prime Minister Hun Sen of Cambodia. Global Witness, I call them Blind Witness, President Paul Kagame of Rwanda. If that's not enough to make you want to buy the book, I don't know what else one can say. So Patrick is the author, as I mentioned, of Very Bad People. And his second book, What Can You Follow Up With? Terrible Humans, will be published in May of this year, and gives the reader a fly-on-the-wall view of activists and journalists exposing crimes, including the operations of the Wagner Group from Russia, sanctions busting, wildlife trafficking, and political corruption in the European Union. And finally, a man who probably needs no introduction. You're waiting to see what I'm going to say, right, Larry?
No, I just leave out the Lord of Liberty part.
All right, Larry Diamond, the Dean of Democracy then, who is the William L. Clayton Senior Fellow at the Hoover Institution, the Mosbacher Senior Fellow in Global Democracy at FSI, and my predecessor as the Mosbacher Director of CDDRL, not immediate predecessor, that's Francis Fukuyama, who's seated out there. And Larry is the Bass University Fellow in Undergraduate Education at Stanford. He is also a Mensch and one of the leading scholars in the world of democracy, its quality, its decline, and how we can make it better. He also, among all the other things he does at Stanford, which is a lot, and we don't have time to mention them, leads the Hoover Institution's program on China's global sharp power and the program on Taiwan and the Indo-Pacific region. He also leads the program on Arab reform, based at CDDRL, where he is also a senior fellow. He co-leads also the Global Digital Policy Incubator at another one of our centers, the Cyber Policy Center. He was the founding editor of the Journal of Democracy, and still works as a consultant for the International Forum for Democratic Studies at the National Endowment for Democracy. And with that, I will turn things over to Larry, who will start the conversation.
Well, thank you all for coming. It's really an honor to be a part of the launch of this extraordinarily important and timely new project, Anat. We're really in your debt for walking across the street with some frequency and becoming a part of CDDRL and launching this program and all the work you're doing. And we certainly are in debt to Patrick, who I think is really not a terrible human being, but a great human being fighting very bad people. And I want to say a few things before I start the Q&A, if I may. The first thing is offered in all sincerity, even though I've only read a little bit of the book so far. This is a very, very good book about very, very bad people. And it's also a highly readable book. And if you don't want to buy the physical copy, you can download it into your iPhone and listen to it while you're walking your dog, and it'll only cost you $10. The second thing I want to say is to read two quotes that are in the book, if I may. Only one of them is by Patrick, who writes, Anat, I'm sure this is one of her favorite sentences in the book. You can sort out most things if you follow the money. And you've clearly done that at great risk sometimes and at great labor in terms of your research. And the second is from another man I admire who wrote the preface, George Soros, who writes, corruption is one of the greatest enemies of democracy. And that relates to my second point. I am literally back 48 hours ago from Ghana. And I can tell you with great trembling conviction, corruption is not one of the greatest enemies. It is the greatest enemy of democracy, certainly in sub-Saharan Africa. And here you have, as you have in South Africa, the two most liberal and successful democracies in Africa of any country of any reasonable size. And corruption is eating both of these democracies alive. And this is your event, not mine. I'm not going to deliver a lecture on Ghana today. But I think much of what you write about in the book, Patrick, in terms of the implications of corruption for the erosion of undermining of development, democracy, and environmental quality and justice, no matter how you rotate it, is just kind of visibly in evidence there, and even more so, of course, elsewhere in sub-Saharan Africa now. So we'll talk about all of these relationships. If you pan out to the question that Anat is asking in this project, of course, we're going to, at some point, have to get very systemic, get beyond very bad people, to talk about the relationship between the corruption you see on the ground, and as you also expose in the book, opaque financial systems, corporate governance failures, and the whole kind of system of international engagement, not only by very bad states led by very bad people like Russia, the Wagner Group, and so on, but by international institutions and organizations that just don't seem to be doing very much about it. So I thought perhaps we could begin with each of you telling your stories, and then we can back up to the more systemic reality. So Patrick, you know, we've heard the top line about Global Witness and its achievements and your founding an instrumental role in it, but could you tell us more about your motivations, your journey really leading to the creation of this, your founding principles, and you know, maybe give us a narrative or two of some specific things you found.
Okay, well, thank you. And I'm very unused to people being nice to me.
That's very clear from a longer list of quotes
So
of tributes to the book.
So I feel a little bit embarrassed. But anyway, but thank you for all of your generosity. Well, like in Britain, all best ideas start in a pub, and Global Witness was no different. It was the Betsy Trotwood off the Farringdon Road in London. And I was volunteering for an environmental organization. I'd made two particularly good friends there. We were sitting having a few lagers on a sunny summer evening. And this was in the early 1990s. And we found out we were, by complete coincidence, really interested in what was going on in Cambodia. And what was going on in Cambodia in the early 1990s was the UN's, up to that date, biggest peacekeeping operation ever. There were 21,000 troops on the ground in Cambodia to bring an end to a civil war by then between the notorious Khmer Rouge rebel group and the government. And also the UN brokered, the first time the UN had actually done it, the first democratic elections in Cambodia. And so we were just talking about that, we were interested, and we had been reading newspaper articles, and they were very vague. There wasn't much information. The place was a war zone. But it said that there were reports of timber, rainforest timber, coming from Cambodia's rainforest across the border into Thailand, and being brought up by the Thai timber industry. And we thought, well, if that's true, presumably that is money that's funding a civil war. Can't think of any other reason why they would do it. And we were kind of greenies, you know, environmentalists, whatever, young, inexperienced. Naivety was a major driver in all of this, I have to say. And we asked ourselves a question, we thought, is that an environmental issue or is that a human rights issue? Environmental because the rainforest has been cut down, but if it's funding a war, it's a human rights issue too. And then we thought, well, if you close that border to that trade, you cut the money to the Khmer Rouge, you stop the war. Why doesn't somebody do that? And we thought, well, why don't we? And we were three people. We had no experience, no money, just a very crazy idea. But we thought we really want to do this. And we spent 18 months trying to get some money together. We got a little bit from the Dutch version of Oxfam, which is called Novib. We had a meeting, I should just say, by way of a narrative, with the then second in command at Oxfam. We sent a proposal in and he called us in for a meeting, and we were ushered into his office and his assistant said, oh, he'll be in a mo. And we could see our proposal on his desk and it said, will they survive, scrawled across it. And we thought, He didn't think so, obviously, because he didn't give us any money. But anyway, we got some money, and our plan was to pose as timber buyers, European timber buyers, travel up and down the Thai-Cambodia border on the Thai side, not the Cambodian side, because that was Khmer Rouge controlled and we'd be dead for sure, and see what we could find. And what we found on that first trip was easier than we thought. We found these massive stockpiles of rainforest timber. We would drive in, photograph it, film people, talk to them. We knew nothing about timber, absolutely nothing. Didn't know what it was worth, what species it was, what anyone did with it, no idea. But it didn't really seem to matter. But we worked out, we cross-referenced all the information. We worked out the trade was earning the Khmer Rouge between $10 to $20 million US dollars every month, and was an absolute threat to the peace process and to this new democracy. And I'll stop in just a mo, because what we managed to do was thinking, okay, where's the pressure we can bring to bear? We have the information, where's the pressure we can bring to bear? And a mentor of ours, a guy called Alan Thornton, said, Washington's the place where everything happens, go there. So we did, had no idea about how Washington worked, but we got through it. And America put pressure on Thailand, the border was closed. And within 18 months, the Khmer Rouge were out of money and had defected. But in the course of that, because we didn't know about corruption, we didn't think about corruption, and the corruption was not a much talked about issue then. But we came across some leaked documents in the course of all of this, which were from the Cambodian prime ministers. There were two, it's a long story, and the Thai defense minister, authorizing the export of 1 million cubic meters of timber worth hundreds of millions of dollars from Khmer Rouge territory into Thailand. What that was evidence of the Cambodian prime ministers and the Khmer Rouge collaborating with each other, the battlefield enemies, to fund the war and to make money. And that was our discovery of, for us, of corruption. And I've probably occupied enough airtime to start anyway. But
before I go to Anat, could you, I know this could be a several-hour narrative, but could you briefly tell us how you went from that to building a world-class organization that has had the impact that you've had?
Sure. Well, we didn't start with a master plan. When we got to October 95, we'd had money for a year, and we were very, very surprised we were still going. And we had no strategy. This guy I mentioned, Alan Thornton, one of the founders of Greenpeace, came to us with this idea, and he said, there's a civil war in Angola, amongst one of several horrible civil wars going on in West Africa at the time. And the UNITA rebel group are funded by diamonds. And why don't you, I'll give you some money, why don't you go off and have a look at that? Long story short, we launched a report in '98 after some investigations, which was the birth of the campaign on blood diamonds. We couldn't investigate it in the same way as we did with timber, you know, where we knew nothing. We tried that with some diamond dealers. And I remember being in this room, and the guy sort of got a plate of diamonds and some tweezers, as far as I was concerned, and said, okay, what do you think? And I picked up the tweezers. And as soon as I did that, he said, you're not diamond dealers. Because they don't do it like that. And so, okay, that wasn't going to work. But anyway, we managed to raise that issue to become a public issue. And I think when we began with the Cambodia stuff, no one was particularly interested, press-wise or anything else. You know, Cambodia, country long way away, whatever. Blood diamonds hit a nerve. And, you know, without any, we had no press office, there were only 4 of us, but it went ballistic. The report came out on the day that civil war re-broke out in Angola. But in the course of researching that, the other half of that civil war was funded by oil, and the government controlled the oil. But as the IMF said, no one knows how much oil they're getting. No one, they suspected $4 billion a year, and they suspected $1 billion of that was going missing. And we thought, we can't just tackle one side in the civil war, we have to tackle both. So we launched a campaign on oil, and it grew from there. And we started looking at corruption generally, and then the realization every corrupt deal needs a bank. Got a bit of banks, on that goes. That's sort of the way it began, the mushroom.
Great. So what's interesting about you two being paired here in this event today, but maybe I can say in this purpose, this cause, is that Patrick, you've kind of started from the ground up, experiencing, you know, these real life stories of corruption and trying to work in a way to the theory of what it's doing to societies and how to combat it. Anat, you're a teacher, you're a thinker, you're a researcher, you're a professor at the best business school in the world. And you kind of started with the theory and moved to the practice of, you know, how corporations are governed or misgoverned, and how societies regulate or fail to regulate corporate excesses, and how it relates to the broadest question we could probably ask, particularly if we're walking back and forth across the street, which is, what is the relationship between capitalism and democracy? So why don't you reflect a little bit on your journey and the journey that led to the creation of this program?
Thank you. Thank you so much. I have a lot of thanks to make, so I'll just do that very briefly. First of all, I have to thank Larry, because actually this idea of this program came from Larry. And the timing of that was when we met in December 2022. I was coming back from a anti-corruption conference that I went to, an international anti-corruption conference that was taking place in Washington, D.C. for the first time ever. And among my objectives going there was to meet Patrick Elliott, whose book I read, whose organization, Global Witness, I became familiar with through a 60-minute story called Anonymous Inc., which exposed their work right here in the US, exposing what they were surprised to hear was the ease with which you can launder money into this country through the top law firms in this country. So these were enablers from the law, not from, you know, corporations in the capitalist system. But anyway, Larry then said, got to start a program in CDDRL. The other person I met in that very same conference is Raymond Baker. And Raymond Baker had a book called Invisible Trillion, which he gave me an advanced copy of, with a preface by forward by Larry Diamond. And I'm like, oh, Larry, I just met Raymond Baker. Raymond Baker is an MBA, Harvard MBA, 1960, and has an organization called Global Financial Integrity. And he discovered what he calls the Achilles heel of capitalism, about which he wrote a book in 2005. And I met him and he said, I bet you I'm the only MBA here. And I said, well, I definitely bet you I'm the only business school faculty here. What is the business school faculty doing in an anti-corruption conference? So it's because I've actually failed to get a panel discussion on the corruption of knowledge into that conference, but I still decided to go and kind of see the scene and who these people are, anti-corruption, and maybe meet people like Patrick Elliott. I didn't know about Raymond Baker, but I asked people to introduce me to people doing corruption or corruption enablers in developed economies. And so because I've already by then really thought a lot about enablers. And enablers of corruption is both about sort of legal corruption in developed countries and ways of corrupting the system, and sort of the enablers of what we all recognize as corruption, you know, bribes and things and extraction in developing democracies. And so it's intertwined. Anyway, continuing with thanks, I have to thank Didi Cow and also Frank over there. And our collaboration with Frank, Didi, and Larry go back to a conference in 2020 on corporations and democracy. And so this was really where we, you know, really put our foot on democracy as a topic for CASI, for the Corporation Society Initiative, to focus on. So it's beyond corporate governance, it's about democratic governance. And they were intertwined. We were by then, or at least I was by then, convinced. And so we did this with a bunch of law schools, policy schools, business schools, and CDDRL CASI at Stanford with the law school at Stanford, and John and then Dean, who's now our provost, that opened that event. And Didi's now, and all four of us are now in this initiative together. Then I have to thank Hesham Salam, who kind of nudged me forward. Okay, let's do it, let's do it, let's do it. And kind of getting through to the busy Catherine Stoner to welcome this program into CDDRL, and to John for agreeing to do this collaboration that brought us to today. Okay, so I am that, and of course, Lisa, Loretta, and Nora, and Amy, the staff directors and project managers that got this beautiful website and all these logistics today that we have to thank for, without whom we couldn't do this. So I come indeed as a theorist, as a finance theorist in a business school. I was not thinking that my work had anything to do with corruption. I lived for 25 years in the little bubble of where financial markets are a wonderful thing. And, we'll write our models and do our math. And that was my life until the financial crisis. So that was a big trigger for me to start asking questions about what may have gone wrong. And that I couldn't look back. A lot of my colleagues that looked at what went wrong shrugged their shoulders and moved on to do their work. And of course, there was a lot of research to be done, but, would you go down to the policy and get your hands dirty and go there and argue with people and challenge people and all of that? Not so convenient, but I just couldn't let go of this. And so I started peeling layer after layer to really start thinking what is going on? What am I seeing? Why am I seeing it? And I can tell you the disciplines that I was educated at would not give me the answer. I had to go out of my silo. I had to look at political science, at sociology, at psychology, at all these things, and at the law, and how the mechanisms of the rule of law were working, how the laws were written, how the laws were enforced, and how that interacted with all these markets. So, capitalism, democracy, big words, and corruption. So far, we discussed corruption. But capitalism and democracy, this is the kind of words that are thrown around a lot. And capitalism is about free markets and about minimal government intervention, et cetera. Well, what does that even mean? How can you have government? How can you have markets at scale? How can you even have corporations come to existence without competent governments? How does anybody's right get protected, including corporate rights? And then how about responsibilities and accountability? What happens there when corporations come into the picture, being empowered, given legal rights and protections, but nobody home when they cause harm? That became my issue. Corporations and the rule of law, capitalism and the rule of law, capitalism and democracy as a way for us to get a rule of law that we want. So here we are. When I read Patrick's book, when I saw the 60-minute report, there were numerous points that resonated with me, that connected with what I was seeing and what I was thinking about, which is why I wanted to meet him. He talks about the enablers, the criminals and the corporations that pay the bribe, the enablers who park their proceeds in real estate in London, New York, Paris, and beyond, offshore bank accounts. All of that are not over there where corruption is in Angola and in all these other countries, but they are over here. So the enablers are here, and therefore, all the different governments are here. And every single day, since I've become so immersed in this issue, in the intersection of capitalism and democracy, every single day there are case studies of that problem. For example, over the weekend, in the emails I get, I subscribe to ProPublica. ProPublica is an investigative reporting outfit, a nonprofit media in this country, and they have a story about how the US government defended the overseas business interest of baby formula makers, and kids paid the price. This is about toddler formula that was getting kids obese, that were getting mothers off breastfeeding in developed countries. And the US Trade Representative was helping the corporations fight against, restrictions in different countries, in Thailand and other countries, to try to limit the marketing, the misleading marketing of these products, addictive products, harmful products, and all of that. So when we teach in this business school, marketing and operations and finance and all of that, are we looking at what can go wrong, or are we not looking at what can go wrong? If you do look, you do see. And then the question is, what are you going to do about it? How do we have a system that actually make the market work for people, make the corporations work for people, make the governments work for people? It's a huge challenge. And, a lot of people are working on it. A lot of good people are working on it. And some of the bad people are just greedy people, people who respond to their incentives, people who, may have gone to the best business schools and are not seeing the full implications of what they're doing. And I think it's our responsibility in this business school and everywhere to talk about these issues and get the system to work better, because our democracies are very fragile right now in all parts of the world. And that interface with capitalism is a piece of it, a big piece of it. And that's what we want to do.
Great. Well, I'd like to keep moving back and
I
forth.
wanted to ask
Oh.
Patrick to talk more about Anna and, Shell.
I'll come to it.
We'll come to it later, yeah.
Weave
Go
that
ahead.
in whenever you'd like, including right now, if you'd like to.
This is about global corporations and. But
Yeah,
whatever.
I mean, it's just something, in the way our work developed as we sort of got more understanding and working on a wider range of things. There's a case that we worked on not that long ago, where a former oil minister in Nigeria called Anat awarded himself an oil concession, the richest offshore oil block in Nigeria. Awarded it to a company called Malibu Oil and Gas. No one knew technically who owned it, but it was him. Then Shell and Eni, the Italian oil company, the largest company in Italy, paid $1.1 billion to the Nigerian government, who paid $1.1 billion to Malibu Oil and Gas. So it wasn't a corrupt deal because Malibu Oil and Gas didn't get paid directly. But we and a few other organizations thought, well, we think this probably is a corrupt deal. And we investigated the hell out of it, and it really, really stank. Shell and Eni, Shell in particular, hired quite a few former MI6 people on their staff. We somehow managed to get hold of lots of internal emails, which showed what they were planning to do, how they were doing it. They knew that a lot of the money was going to go into the election campaign, a bit like Jonathan in Nigeria. It got blown into the open. It became a big court case with the Italian prosecutor in Milan prosecuting Shell and Eni, and ultimately failing. And I have no doubt at all that those companies were guilty of bribery and corruption. But what we saw as well was just either the hurdles that law enforcement faced. So in the case of Britain, the Serious Fraud Office or Proceeds of Crime Unit, woefully underfunded, getting information, but not getting the backup to really push it. But governments absolutely being on side, either overtly or not overtly, with those companies. It didn't suit them at all. And I'm talking about, Western governments. And so there's kind of an effective impunity. So corruption cases are enormously difficult, complicated, and expensive to prosecute. People don't want to do it. I talked to a guy, an American friend, works for a law firm, who said that the Serious Fraud Office's budget is about the same as the, I don't know what you call it, but the attorney's office in Arizona. For a major financial center, just totally inadequate. And so you have to ask yourself the question, how interested are our governments in really clamping down on this issue?
The reason Anna came up, it's also, Larry, you might remember that you moderated a panel in that Cooperation and Democracy Conference at the request of Luigi Zingales, who was on the board of ENA and found himself isolated, wanting us to bring in a US prosecutor on the Foreign Corrupt Practice Act in the US, asking whether the US could help through its law against corruption by Foreign Corrupt Practice Act to bring any order to this issue. And it wasn't clear, like, if there's corruption, who is going to do something about it, was sort of the issue. He was disappointed when he was at the board of ENA because he found himself very isolated on the board, and people not wanting to talk about it and not wanting to go there and wanting to get away with what was going on. So it's like, again, you go on a corporate board, and if you want to actually look at something that might go wrong, they don't want to hear it. They'd rather not. And then if they can get the government not to do something about it, and, you know, unless some other government does something about it, you know, you get away with it.
I want to, before I come to the big systemic question you want us to get to about the relationship between capitalism in crisis and democracy in very deep recession, if I can put it that way, and then we have to interrogate whether capitalism is really in crisis. I want to talk a little bit more about these pieces. And before I come to the question about enablers, you shared your stories. I'll share one of mine very briefly. So like Raymond Baker, my passion, my experience, my analytic conviction that corruption and kleptocracy are very much at the core of the problem of underdevelopment in the world, particularly, say, in the post-colonial era, is shaped by my experience in Nigeria in the 1970s, 1980s. And in the 1990s, you will know, Patrick, one of the worst tyrants in the world, and one of the greediest and most corrupt and destructive, the military dictator Sani Abacha was ruling Nigeria and was putting the brave advocates of environmental defense and anti-corruption led by Ken Saro-Wiwa in the Niger Delta on trial with the intention of hanging them, which ultimately he did. A group of US scholars in Nigeria, including myself, went to the United States government, I have to be very careful now, and saw a high official in the US government and pleaded with the US government to impose sanctions or threaten serious crippling sanctions against the Abacha regime if they murdered Ken Saro-Wiwa and the other Ogoni activists in the Niger Delta, oil-rich Delta, in the show trial. And the answer we got back was, and you don't forget a statement like this, right? It's just kind of burned in your memory, the exact words. We can't do that, and the words "any" reminded me of it. We can't do that because if we did, the Nigerians would take away our oil concessions and give them to the French and Italians. And fast forward now, there's a new Cold War over and in Africa. It's not only about oil, it's about strategic minerals of all kinds. So talk about enablers in any way you'd like to, Patrick.
I don't think the company's too polite to let me talk about them how I'd like to, but yeah, I think what we're all sort of talking around here is that corruption is a globalized industry. Very often people like to think, oh, it's something that happens in that hot tropical country there or whatever, but how does it work? And, you know, that was a brilliant example and a chilling example of that at a top government level. From our perspective and through a corruption lens, which is sort of the only expertise I have really, when we would carry out an investigation, okay, there's the stuff you find out. So how's something done? And going back to your question on how did we evolve? So, you know, every corrupt deal needs a bank. Every corrupt deal needs an anonymously owned company, the getaway cars for crime, really. So we started looking at all of those things. And of course, what you find is that, you know, anti-corruption organizations like ours, but also law enforcement, are faced with often impenetrable barriers of anonymity. Whole networks of anonymous companies from the, you know, most of which actually are probably in the UK and US, but more famously in the Caribbean or the South Pacific. And so it's very hard to sort of penetrate that veil. And that's, you know, basically accepted. It's an accepted way of doing business. If you do penetrate the veil and you get the information and you publish it like we do, then you get the law firms after you. I was talking with a gentleman there about Mishcon de Reya in London, which is a pet obsession of mine, whose business model, the stated business model, was to take on dodgy clients because they get more money from them. And the chances are they can throw so much money in now what's called slap suits at organizations like ours or individual activists, that whether you're right or wrong, you lose because you just can't fight that wealth. The accountancy firms who know what's going on, the big 4 or 5, however many there are these days, the PR companies, they're all this whole network. In the book, I call it the pinstripe army of enablers who can, you know, make all this stuff happen. And, you know, just another example from the past, back in, I think 2006, we did a report called It's a Gas. And we were looking at natural gas being piped from Turkmenistan to the EU via Russia and the Ukraine. And the Ukrainian part of the pipeline was taken over by a company that no one had ever heard of. It had no experience or no background at all in oil or gas. So what was its purpose, this company? It's called Rossukenergo, as I remember. And its only purpose was to make money. It was to cream money. And we made a recommendation in that report. We found out who it was, a guy called Dmitry Firtash. And we said, how can the EU be reliant on energy security when you have this kind of thing in the pipeline, long before the Ukraine war happened? That's not to say anything about our predictive capacity. We didn't have it. It was just, it struck us that was deeply wrong. And part of what we were trying to build up was this issue of, you know, EU energy security. We weren't trying to promote the use of fossil fuels in the EU, but how at risk we were by not tackling this kind of corruption. But we could get nowhere with it. We could get no meaningful action against it. Firtash, as soon as Russia invaded Ukraine, was sanctioned as one of the many oligarchs who were.
You want to comment on enablers?
Well, enablers, yeah, is a term I used in a sort of, I looked at what happened to me in 5-6 years of lobbying for financial reform. And, you know, in order to be so unsuccessful like I was, there had to be a lot of enablers of the system as it is, or the failed regulations as they still are. And the enablers allowed, you know, truth analysis, valid analysis to be distorted. The enablers confused the public, the enablers confused the policymakers, and they included, obviously, you know, the accounting firms and the credit rating agencies and the and lawyers, and they included economists and academics as well. So they had a role in this system to do analysis, some of which were very flawed, some of which were based on very bad assumptions, on narratives that seemed to reverse engineer what we saw as good, and which ended up with being favored by people with power who preferred certain narratives. About the financial crisis. Ben Bernanke was my colleague, preferred a narrative about how it was all in the plumbing and all, and that same narrative was being advanced for, crisis in the last year in banking. It's all in the plumbing, it's all liquidity, just a sudden run on a clear blue day. And that is a false narrative that diverts attention to what you can do. So this is among my deepest disappointment that they are enablers, and sometimes it's what they do, and sometimes it's just what they don't do. It's just not convenient to do anything, and so you stand by. So enablers are also passive enablers. They just fail to do something. So, in the end of the book in 2013, we talked about the lack of political will. So what does political will take in a democracy? It takes the public knowing something, and the public gets easily confused. It takes the policymakers wanting to do what they need to do, but you got campaign contributions, you got some lobbyists telling you something that might sound right, whatever, and the political will doesn't get found, gets lost. Truth loses power, etc. Now we have social media, political discourse gets corrupted. So there's much more going on. A lot of it, all of it, ends up being some for-profit entity finding ways to get into the discourse to confuse a policymaker or the broader public. So we have a huge challenge, and so the erosion of democracy, or the recession of democracy, as you call it, Larry, in our democracies, is a lot to do with the forces of capitalism. And we have research on that in various places. It's not, if we have, with this program, I'm hoping to collaborate, as long as the research itself is not corrupted. And that is a big problem. I am going to go to a conference in Chicago in which the panel I'm on is called "This Conference is Not Paid for by Big Tech." Well, I mean, we had conferences in this very business school funded by bank lobbyists. We don't have it right now, maybe because I'm still here, but I don't know whether it's profitable to get funding from we have this debate at Dora right now at the school about whether they should take money from fossil fuel or not. And it's we want to do good, and maybe taking money is good, even if the people who give you the money have some conflicts of interest, and maybe everybody says that the conflicts of interest won't affect things, but sometimes they affect things very subtly. A lot of where you see, conflicts of interest in the media, and I didn't mention media, in media that is, nominally there to hold government to account or to hold power to account in general, have their own issues, access issues. They don't want to annoy the people who give them access. I see this a lot when I interact with media, that certain media cannot write certain things, or their editors don't want them to write certain things. The editor of an editor in the Telegraph resigned because they wouldn't publish a story about HSBC money laundering, because HSBC was a big advertiser in the Telegraph. So, I mean, you just see these things about the numerous ways in which private power interferes with democracy, private power of people and private power of corporations. And so unless we recognize that, we will not be able to fix our democracies, which then are to create rules for everybody, corporations and people alike. And that's what we want, what we have to do if we want a system that works. So the enablers include media, include academia, include a lot of people, but there are a lot of good people in all these places too. So, we want the good people to have more power and the bad people to have less power.
Well, you've raised this
But can I just add
Yeah,
something?
please go ahead.
Sorry, yeah. So something just occurred to me when you were talking on that, relating to climate change. As everyone will know, at the Rio Earth Summit in 1992, I think it was 126 governments committed to a whole range of pledges, not least of which was to bring down carbon emissions to form the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, and a whole load of other stuff. Not one of those pledges has been kept, not one. And during that period, as we all know, you only have to read the papers, look at the TV, fossil fuel industry has been pushing back again and again and again, all the time, pushing back, leaning on the governments, giving political donations, sending their lobbyists out in force. And so those who have resisted that, and I'm looking at Kumi over there, you know, in his role leading Greenpeace in the past, you know, many organizations work really, really hard to try and raise the issue of climate change, the threat of fossil fuels. And what we're seeing now in Europe, I'm not sure about the States, you know, in the UK, they're making it illegal to carry out many forms of protest against the fossil fuel industry with punitive punishments on people. You know, you block a road for half an hour, you're in jail for 2 years. And that kind of thing. And Shell have just taken out a case against Greenpeace for occupying a platform, an oil platform. I can't remember how much it is. It's multi-million, I think. A real threat to Greenpeace. So you had a failure of the democratic process, and the government's pledged to various things. They failed to carry it through. The civil society used all of the legal means available to them for the next 30 years. And the only thing you're left with at the end is you've got to do something illegal and pay the price because the governments are not doing their job.
So might as well now, since Anat has introduced it, get to the systemic issue, the relationship between capitalism and democracy. I mean, when you consider that you are talking about private corporations, Patrick, and the accountants, the lawyers, the bankers are all part of the capitalist system, you know, is there something just rotten about capitalism as a global system? Is there something intrinsically rotten about capitalism, period? Or might it just be the case that people in any system are potentially very bad people without, I see is my colleague Frank Fukuyama still sitting there? Strong states with strong rule of law and regulatory institutions to restrain them and put the fear of God into them by, you know, holding them accountable and, you know, ensuring that people who do very bad things that are in fact violations of the law will be discovered, and not just by you and Global Witness and your work, but by the legal authorities and held accountable. So maybe now, Patrick, let's start with you and talk about the systemic question and how you see the relationship between capitalism and democracy. And we'll briefly conclude, or you can reflect on what the real levers of change are.
Probably Anat's area of expertise more than mine, but from the perspective that I've had, I think the rule of law is a critical one. What we've seen, I think, in my adult lifetime is a real decline in kind of all the issues we're talking about. Companies are getting away with more than they did. And whenever, you know, we, and I know it's true of other organizations, try and get a law into place about, you know, curbing corruption or being transparent about your payments to countries that, you know, you're buying oil and gas from or whatever, you're always meeting with this barrage of lobbying from the industry, saying they don't want to do it, that they don't want a law, and that they have more influence than we do. But also, they will promote voluntary standards. certification of this, or yes, of course, we'll do net zero by this date, or whatever it might be. In our experience, voluntarism simply doesn't work. You cannot trust a profit-making company, especially a listed company whose duty it is to return the maximum amount to the shareholders in the next 3 years or 5 years. You cannot trust them. They've shown in every case to be completely untrustworthy. So you have to change that system. That's one thing, that short-termism of public listed companies. You know, they have to be thinking, going in sort of the B Corps direction. They need to be forced to do it. Yeah, so, and I think that, yeah, you can't trust the voluntarism, the voluntary approach, you know, corporate social responsibility. It's a joke. So what, you know, we've termed it predatory capitalism. You know, it's not, we're anti-capitalist, but it's predatory capitalism. And whether that's, you know, relating to climate or whatever, that, you know, you're referring, Larry, to your experience in Nigeria, and certainly it's my experience of, you know, I guess a neo-colonialism. You know, a lot of the most resource-rich countries are amongst the poorest countries in the world. The resource curse is a, you know, a well-used term. And they're the poorest countries in the world, ruled by corrupt elites, precisely because they're resource-rich, and precisely because the people who want those resources, the rich world, are happy to turn a blind eye to what takes those, to how to get those resources. And I think we're at a real crux point because of, you know, the issue of transition minerals now. And if you look at Democratic Republic of Congo, it possesses 2/3 of the world's cobalt, which is essential to the energy transition. And everybody's lining up to get a slice of that pie. You know, Russia, the Wagner Group, are taking over in many countries. And I read about 3 weeks ago that Russia and DRC have signed a military pact. You've got China, the EU, all want to go in there. And if they're going to act like the colonial powers that most of them once were, then it's going to be a shit show, excuse my French. Now we really, really need to be serious about getting this right, or we're just going to repeat the cycle we've been going on, you know, for a century or two.
Yeah, so I think one of the most important things in terms of getting this systemically, you know, to solve this is, first of all, to get out of the false dichotomies that we keep being offered, that somehow, you know, there's this big government, the socialism, and this capitalism over their free market. And, you know, what we're talking about and what you were just mentioning, we had together with inviting Larry Raymond Baker, we had also in May 2023, author of a book called The Big Myth, which was about that propaganda of hating the government in the US, and that has been part of the problem. And, you know, we had an event also last year with Tariq Fancy, a BlackRock sustainable investor who called BS on this, and you were using corporate social responsibility. Our event was called CRS, corporate social responsibility, plus ESG, the recent buzzword, equals BS, question mark. So that was the equation we posted as a thing. And in it, interviewed by Bethany McLean, who's also going to be here again this week, people asked him about free market, and he said free market is one of the big hoax, is a big hoax, he said. Saying that the government is intervening in free market is just like saying that the NBA is interfering in the free game of basketball by setting the 3-point line someplace. You know, no rules, no market. So to your point, Patrick, you know, the law is our joint collective commitment to a set of rules that we ourselves would be tempted to break. You know, why do we have a speed limit on the road? You know, or law against drunk driving. We may be tempted to drive too fast, but the policeman is there to stop us and remind us that we shouldn't. So same here. And that applies to people, very bad people, but it also, in most challenges, applying it to corporations, because corporations have so much of a veil of secrecy behind them and so much deniability to individuals that, you know, people start being angry about why no executive goes to jail. And this is a good, serious question to ask. Who should bear the liability when a corporation repeatedly causes harm? Should it ever fall on any person? If that person was a high-level responsible officer, should they not be responsible that their corporation doesn't cause harm? Those are the kinds of questions that I hope this program will go to. We didn't add the rule of law to the name because democracy is supposed to embody a rule of law that the people want. The rule of law should represent the people in a democracy, and that rule of law should apply to these legal persons that we enable to exist and whose rights we protect in markets and in the economy, even speech rights and other rights. But if they have all these rights, they should, if they can go to courts to enforce contracts, if they can sue, if they can do all these things, they should also be responsible to society and accountable to the people. And so that's how we're going to get democratic accountability. The first item of business is education. So I always fall back on the fact that we need to educate the public. I start, you know, because I have the opportunity to start with Stanford undergraduates. That's the only, when people say to me, you know, how depressing everything is, I say, well, I can say I had 150 students and they understand the world better right now. And I'll have somebody walk up to me and, you know, advisory board and say, oh, my daughter took your class and she now sees how the world works. So can we teach the young people who might get some fairy tale story in high school about how the place actually works, to be savvy in dealing with the financial sector, which I happen to know a lot about, so I teach them that, and how corporations operate and what we're allowing and not allowing people and corporations to do, and what should we allow and not allow people and corporations to do. That's the essence of, you know, civic minded, you know, leadership, civic, you know, just civic being in a democracy. So, you know, our democracy should be where, you know, justice comes about. That's my hope.
So thank you very much for that. That was a really interesting discussion. I have a question about the way that this whole system has been affected by the rise of cryptocurrencies. Patrick's story about the timber being smuggled out of Cambodia reminded me of the story in Zeke Fo's book, Money Go Up, about the crypto industry, that there's apparently an entire city in Cambodia where people are captured and forced to market Tether. So Fo was interested in how did Tether survive as a stable coin? And so they're actually doing this in a closed city in Cambodia where, you know, hundreds of people try to market this coin to retirees in North America. And it seems to me that this whole sector has created this entire extremely non-transparent, you know, world in which the kinds of phenomena you're describing are, you know,
Yeah.
it's an open field for that sort of thing.
Yes, I loved Number Go Up, highly recommended book by Zeke Fox of Bloomberg, who traces this sector. You know, it started with public anger and Bitcoin in 2008. All of a sudden, we were supposed to, you know, have a the trustless system, but we were supposed to trust it somehow. So, and there's some algorithm, very heavy, you know, resource demanding, and the rest is, oh, I don't know, bullshit. I mean, you can sell all kinds of things to people. And if you get a lot of people believing in something, it can also hold value for a while. I think in 15 years, it's hard to see the actual use case for, we have plenty of currencies in the world. And so having currencies is not our problem. And some currencies are just useful for certain, you know, things. I would say, okay, you go to Las Vegas and you change your central bank money for, you know, little tokens, and then you play and then you change them back. You know, you may have some frequent flyer miles and they will buy you a ticket on a particular airline. So there are many ways to pay for things in a particular context. You have an Axie Infinity game and, you know, but from that to a useful currency for payments, you know, the story doesn't work. But of course, hype is, you know, lives. And so I don't know where this is going, but it certainly fits into the picture of, you know, opacity and confusion and fear of missing out and all kinds of things.
Great. Who else has a question? Don Emerson?
Oh my God, you're walking this.
Well, it seems like the most efficient way to do it.
This is a fascinating experience. And unfortunately, my mind is kind of all over the place. My mind visits an alternative universe, which is exactly like this one, except for the content. And in that alternate universe, Stanford University, the business school at Stanford University, is now hosting a discussion of an initiative about socialism and autocracy and the relationship between the two. Because if we look at capitalism and autocracy, I think for many people, not everybody, of course, there's a natural tendency to think, aha, yes, capitalism can endanger democracy. But can democracy endanger capitalism? Now, that's an intriguing question. I'm not sure if it's on the agenda of the initiative. And in a way, one could argue that what I'm doing is not helpful at all, because the detail, the practicality of activists who don't worry about the theoretical meanings of terms, right, but actually are operating on essentially ethical principles that don't require actually a lot of theoretical justification. So, you know, is there a causal relationship between what happens in capitalism and what happens in democracy? And sometimes can that relationship be ethically unfortunate? And how do we single out those connections, those causal connections, to try to prevent them? Because we're living under these two gigantic words, and the temptation is to really operate at a level of abstraction. Do we really even need to talk about capitalism and democracy, given the practicality of the experiences that you have just shared, which are essentially ethical?
Anat?
Well, I mean, the issue is one about institutions. You do not have anything kind of working in scale without some institutions. And then I ask a question of governance, that's all. And I ask it of all institutions. The people, in institutions and people. Institutions are abstract things, okay? We created them out of, you know, election and constitutions and things of that sort in the you know, in the political sphere, and we create them out of the law, you know, when they're private sector institutions, corporations, nonprofits, you name it, partnerships, everybody exists under the law as an institution. Otherwise, we're just individuals in tribes and, you know, we may barter. But when you have markets at scale with people you don't know, you need institutions, you need contract and contract enforcement. That's all. We're just talking about infrastructure now of markets. So I don't know, when you say democracy can undermine, what is capitalism anyway? Capitalism is a set of markets, a set of institutions that are private sector based. But private sector needs the government to protect its rights and to enforce its contracts, and then to protect the people who are affected by it. That's all we're talking about here. So sure, we do need to talk about capitalism and democracy because they interact, because the institutions of democracy and the institutions of capitalism, be it corporations and markets, interact with one another. The people in them interact with one another. If people in the corporations and people in the government collude to harm the public, that's the main concern, okay? And they both then fail the people. So what I want is for capitalism and democracy to work for the people. And I always make a parallel between institutions of the government and institutions of the private sector and their governance.
You want to add anything, Patrick?
Yeah, I'd like to add something to that. Yeah, I mean, in my experience, and going back to the term I used earlier, the resource curse, whereby a lot of resource-rich countries are, in fact, the poorest. because of the way the exploitation has happened. And what I've seen in so many places is that as soon as a corrupt leader, whether that's a head of state or a senior politician, takes money from a company, and those companies, as we talked about earlier, could be multinationals, American for sure. You know, my colleague Simon, who works on oil, says his working belief is that every oil deal is corrupt. It's just a question of how they did it this time. And he says that not blithely. So the politician takes the money, and now their allegiance is inevitably shifting away from the electorate, presuming he or she were elected, to their new money supplier. So their allegiance goes towards the companies. And then, because they're probably talking about money, which is more than anyone could usually dream of, they want to protect that money. They don't want to lose it. And so they'll start building a heavy mob around them. They'll put big walls on the palace and whatever, and retreat into that. They don't want to lose the next election because this is going very, very nicely for them. So the democratic process is going to be screwed from within. You're seeing this again and again and again. And you end up with autocracy. And you end up with populations that are extremely poor. I quoted a figure in the book, it'll have changed by now, but when I wrote the book, since the 1950s, around $300 billion worth of oil had been pumped out of Nigeria, most of which by Shell. And in the year I wrote the book, Nigeria overtook India as the country with the poorest population. 87 million people, 80% of the population living on less than $2 a day. So that's what capitalism's done for Nigeria. And they had an autocratic government for a lot of that time. So I don't look at this from, you know, the way you posited it, like, you know, activists sort of look at, okay, it's got to be ethical. It's like, it's just an observation about what corruption does, and corruption is part of what's wrong with capitalism.
I got the microphone.
Especially the law, Catherine.
So, so I wanted to ask how you're defining corruption, and just picking up on your last point there, is that capitalism doing that, or is that a weak state doing that? Because it is possible to pump oil without ripping off all the people who live there. And I'm thinking of Norway, I'm Canadian, Canada. So, you know, Nigeria had a weak state before they found oil, have a weak state. So it's not surprising to me that they want to maintain access to those rents, right? And continue to have a weak state and authoritarian government without transparency. So it's not necessarily oil that's done the problem, that's created the problem, or capitalism, but oil has exacerbated a problem that existed before. So, I mean, isn't governance basically the problem here, getting back to your issue with rule of law? And you know, obviously markets without rules is like a basketball game without rules, right? It would be chaos. So there have to be some rules, but there are places and sectors where rules exist and actually do work. And so could we also talk a little bit about successes and regulatory successes? One I think of is tobacco. In this country, it's not successful everywhere, but you know, there's been some regulation and improvement there.
Just try and be brief in your responses,
very quick.
because we're not leaving here without getting Kumi Naidu's question. So go ahead.
Okay. Yes, so the state needs to be competent. The state needs to be willing to do what it needs to do, basically. And there are a lot of examples of states doing that. The US, you know, once the public gets the information, once there is a sort of broad understanding that certain rules need to be put in place, then they can be put in place. So oftentimes it's because of some scandal, or because, you know, you have some expose of whatever, Facebook files or whatever, and all of a sudden there's energy behind something. From that to doing something, there are different philosophies. In Europe, they have more of a precautionary, you know, approach to regulation. Here, it's much, the default is that the private sector can do what it wants to do. And only when there's a lot of harm that we somehow discover might we wake up to a problem. So we're less precautionary in our approach. So, but definitely The issue is always ultimately, that's why I ended up getting to democracy from coming from where I was, that if democracy doesn't work, we can't get the financial system that I want. And then why is democracy not working for this sector? And then you look around and how it doesn't work here or there or elsewhere. Okay, you have a question, you want?
Did you have anything you wanted to say on this before I come to Kumi?
I couldn't take any of Kumi's time.
Go ahead. Kumi.
Thank you. Patrick and the Global Witness, I just want to say one of the very important contributions they made to the world of protecting the space for civil society was tracking the number of environmental activists that are killed on on a weekly basis. So about 10 years ago, it was 2 activists a year. And right now it's 4 activists roughly per year. Sorry, I beg your pardon, per week. Per week. So I just would like to just ask us all to just pause and bring a human-centric component into this conversation. My question, though, is that, and I currently serve on the International Council of Transparency International, where we've been grappling with the issue of when we talk about corruption, we homogenize it. We talk about, and it's really picking on Catherine's question there. So from the Global South perspective, what we say is that there are 3 types of corruption, right? One is what we call petty corruption, when a police officer stops you on the street and asks you for a bribe in lieu of paying a fine. And that's obnoxious, it shouldn't happen, but actually the impact on the national economy is quite limited because money is still circulating within that national economy. The second form of corruption is large-scale corruption, which, as the work of Global Witness eloquently shows, is very much about extractive industries, right? But let's just be very clear that none of that big-scale corruption that happens in the Global South would be possible without the participation, the collusion, and the active benefiting by powerful interests in the Global North, right? And the third corruption is what you could call policy corruption, in the sense that just because slavery was legal at one point, never made it moral or just and so on. So yeah, just because fossil fuels is legal, right, through policy, doesn't mean that it. So my question is, in the space of your work, are you thinking about having a little bit of a gradation when you tackle the specific question of corruption? And the last thing that I just wanted to say, I liked your question very much. Thank you. But there's a reflection that others have said it before me. What does it say about us that we live in a world where the majority of people can find it easier to imagine the end of the world as a result of climate change, but find it very, very difficult to imagine the end of capitalism? The fact that most people can actually embrace the idea of the world ending by climate change, but actually one of the systems that has driven us there. Yeah, I'd love some reflections on that. Thank you.
Okay, we'll start with you, Patrick.
Well, he said it better than I could.
Say, it's going to be your last chance to say anything on this platform, so say whatever you'd like.
I'll let Anat go first and I'll dream something up.
Well, to your question about policy gradation, definitely, there are tons of policy issues, lots and lots of policy issues. That's why it's difficult for public to really get, involved, because there's just so many different things and they require expertise. That what we should strive for is that, less conflicted expertise and more, in a setting in which unconflicted experts who care about, really sort of good social planners actually set the rules. And there's a lot of rules determined in the private sector, even accounting rules and, auditing standards and things of that sort. And the regulators very meek about those things. In the end, they got very few powers. And so as you look at places in finance, like I know most closely, there's plenty to do, and it's very hard to get it because it's kind of obscure. Other areas, you have dead people, you might be able to get some attention to it, you might be able to get some law against smoking or against advertising of, e-cigarettes or whatever, and or against pollution for clean air or safety of, trains or whatever. So, there's just a lot to do, and we just need to, get people to do it in the government and have enough resources to get it right and not overly complex, but just right. And then on the final point about capitalism, and just my last words, yes, it's baked into us, this notion that, the private sector is the engine of growth and the engine of innovation, and that is true. It is true. It's just there's sort of, I call it financialized capitalism because I come from finance. He calls it predatory capitalism. It's the capitalism that is undermining democracy, the type we want to kind of push back from. Once democracy asserts itself properly, then we will be able to get the gains of capitalism.
Right. Well, I'd like to say two things in conclusion, unless you have anything else you want to say, Patrick.
And the only other thing I said to really endorse what Kumi was saying, and to pick up on what you just said, Anat, the private sector is the engine of growth, but you cannot have unlimited growth in a finite world.
Well stated. I'll just answer Don Emerson's point first in my own direct way. If you had a conference on the relationship between socialism and autocracy, I think it would be a very short conference because every real existing socialism, rather than the socialism of Karl Marx's imagination, has been a disaster for political freedom and individual rights. There's no contrary case, and to my mind, there are powerful theoretical and logical reasons why there'll never be. You concentrate that level of power in the state and take away the potential countervailing power of private property and individual initiative, and that's what you're going to get. I think we've had enough natural experiments. And I would say to you, Kumi, that a different version of what Anat said, that no one, I think, is really objecting to individual enterprise and initiative, honestly earned, transparently conducted, rule of law minded, with concern for the community. It's the predatory capitalism that run amok and breaking free of transparency and democratic regulation that I think really threatens fairness, human well-being, and democracy itself. And I'll just say finally, to put it in a human dimension, which you asked us to do, we were kind of doing at the beginning, I'll do at the end. I once just compared the single best, to my mind, if you need a single statistic, for human development. What percentage of children under the age of 5 die? Under 5 mortality. It's a UN statistic. It's available for all countries over probably 65, 70 years now. And you can look, Nigeria and Ghana became independent within 3 years of one another. They start out in very similar terms, over 20% of children under 5 dying. And then, after a certain period of time, particularly when Ghana emerges from the worst of its dictatorship, Ghana starts to decline much more rapidly than Nigeria. And I think that you can attribute, frankly, all of the additional deaths of children under 5 in Nigeria to the fact that the quality of governance in Nigeria remains abysmally bad, and it gets better in Ghana, particularly after 2000, but really beginning in the 1990s when Jerry Rawlings at least subjected himself to constitutionalism and multi-partyism. And that 30 years of excess deaths is 3 million Nigerian children now, maybe more. And it's all due to bad governance, nothing else. And most of that, I think, is due to oil. And when Ghana discovered oil, I said, oh my God, this is the worst thing that has ever happened to Ghana. And indeed, governance is deteriorating now. And I think the resource curse is a major reason why. Anyway, please join me in thanking Patrick and Anat and congratulating Anat on the credit program.